Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tobin Zalman. I'm Vice President of Product Development at Cloudability. Thanks for joining me this afternoon to geek out on reserved instances. Hope you're all ready for this. Today, I would like to propose a new methodology for purchasing RIs. And so to that end, we're going to look at how RIs are applied and try and get a better understanding of that. I'm going to talk through some of the metrics that you really want to measure when you are purchasing reserved instances. And finally, we're going to look at how to adjust RIs to your infrastructure so that you can ultimately achieve 95% coverage with reserved instances. Before we get going, though, I want to take just a moment and talk a little bit about Cloudability, because if you're not familiar with us, this will kind of put some context around a lot of the data that I'll be presenting today. So Cloudability provides cloud cost analytics, and we have a host of features that support that. We increase transparency around spend management across your organization. We let you dive deeper into the data with cost and usage analytics. That data drives our RI purchase recommendations. And finally, we have a host of enterprise enablement tools that let you get the right data to the right person in your organization at the right time. Currently, we're managing about $1.3 billion in cloud spend. And when I checked this morning, we're managing about 82,000 different RIs. So there's an awful lot of data that we've seen, obviously, across all of this. And so I've aggregated a lot of that data into the analysis that I'll be presenting today. So let me start by talking through an RI purchasing methodology. And there's a few things that we want to kind of pick apart here. The first is, why buy RIs? And the second is, why go for 95% coverage? Well, to begin, RIs are the easiest way to control cost. And for somebody like me that runs a product and engineering group, I love them. I can focus on building features and don't have to focus nearly as much on iterating engineering cycles in order to create greater efficiency. So it's a really effective way to reduce cost, especially when you reach some sort of infrastructure inflection point. The second thing is that every dollar you spend on on-demand literally could be about 50% cheaper with an RI. So it really makes an awful lot of sense to try and get as much coverage of all of your usage with RIs so that you're driving down the cost as low as you possibly can. Now, the reality with cloud is that you have scalable architecture, and so it's not really practical to have 100% coverage. Which is totally fine. You're going to have auto-scaling. You're going to spin instances up for test or development purposes. There's a whole host of reasons why 100% coverage isn't very practical. But what you'll see when we look through this methodology is that it is fairly practical to get fairly close to 90 to 95% coverage if you follow a fairly iterative approach to RI purchasing and modifications. The reality is that there are a host of things that drive changes to your infrastructure and make cloud architecture fairly dynamic. And so I want to talk through those just a little bit because I think it helps make sense of what and why these changes happen. First, application needs change over time. You reach scale points, the app becomes more sophisticated, you need more compute, more memory, more storage-intensive instances, so you change your infrastructure. Prices change. We all know Amazon is fairly aggressively driving down price, and so as price drops, it can change the cost profile of your infrastructure. You may go to more expensive, what were previously more expensive instances. You may increase the number of instances you're running, but price can change your overall footprint. And finally, new optimized instance types introduced by Amazon let you leverage a whole host of new technologies in order to make your app more efficient. The bottom line is all three of these will create changes in your infrastructure, but all three of them are good. That's why we're on the cloud. That's why we're all here today, so that we can have fairly dynamic architecture and leverage these things as they happen. The reality, though, is you want to anticipate these changes and constantly tweak your reservations so that you can really maximize your coverage and ultimately maximize your savings. If you don't do that, we see a series of behaviors typically happen. One is companies will kind of bet the house on reactionary purchases. So they'll make very short-sighted decisions on where they can save money now and not necessarily focus on how those align to where their infrastructure is going long term. And what happens when we see this behavior occur is that you end up with burn victims. So somebody buys an RI, you get a little bit of savings for a while, but over time that savings dissipates, and then there's an attitudinal barrier in the organization to buying RIs again because they don't work. So what we want to look at today with our methodology is a way that you can kind of beat the house on this, so to speak, and make sure you're not doing reactionary purchases. The other behavior is buying too little, too late. And so you worry about the implications of dropping money on an RI and getting locked in. And so companies will simply spend too little on reservations and have too small a coverage and end up driving their overall hourly cost up because they're relying increasingly on on-demand usage. The result of both of these is that you're just burning money. I mean, there's just no way around it. If you're not effectively using reservations, it's tantamount to burning money because a RI-backed instance is just right out of the gate cheaper. So what I'm curious about is those of you in attendance here, show of hands, how many of you are doing annual RI buys? So a smattering. How about quarterly? Monthly? How many are doing monthly RI buys? I'm curious there. Okay. And how many are just kind of doing it ad hoc whenever the need strikes? Okay. So what we're going to do is break down which of those cadence of purchases makes the most sense. And we're going to do that by outlining what I'm calling a reservation management methodology, but really is more of an infrastructure management methodology. And the reason that I'm articulating it this way is because fundamentally, reservations and infrastructure are two sides of the same coin. And the reason that they're two sides of the same coin is because if you do them right, they influence each other in a positive way. The good news is this problem area is not new to RI buying. There's an awful lot of areas where you have this sort of cycle management. So we can learn from some of those areas. And the one that I want to draw on today is the type of management or iterative change control that we've seen in things like lean manufacturing and in lean software development. So today we're going to talk about the buy, measure, learn iterative approach to RI buying. And what we do in these phases is in the buy phase, you're purchasing reservations and you're purchasing instances. Once you have those bought, you're going to measure the effectiveness or the ROI of those instances before finally you draw conclusions from those and work to align your reservations and your infrastructure to maximize savings. The goal with all of this is to minimize the time through the loop. So over time, you want to reduce how long it takes you to go through these three steps. So let's look at how we do that. We're going to start by looking at how you buy RIs. And there's a couple topics I want to focus on here. The first is just briefly explaining reservations and how they work. And second, we're going to go through some purchasing strategies so that you understand how to actually attack this stuff. So to begin on understanding reservations, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. If you're interested in getting into the mechanics of how RIs work, I direct you to our blog on cloudability.com. We have a host of content about how RIs work, the mechanics of them, etc. So to begin, RIs have two parts to them. They have cost savings and they have a capacity reservation. On the cost savings side, this is where we're going to spend most of our time today. But basically, you pay a little bit of money up front and you get a lower hourly cost. It's as simple as that. But there's a second piece to RIs that a lot of people don't focus on, and that's capacity reservation. So when you have an RI and there's a run on capacity with AWS for any reason, and the most likely reason, quite frankly, these days is they introduce a new instance type and they simply don't have a whole lot of supply. And so you buy reservations for those to ensure that when supply does become constrained, you have a seat at the table, and when you go to spin one up, you're kind of first in line, at least with the other RI holders, in order to have that instance type fulfilled. So capacity reservations, although we won't focus on them today, actually have a lot of strategic value when you're buying RIs and managing your infrastructure. The second thing that's important to understand here is that reservations are applied each hour. So when we talk about reservations, we typically talk about RI term being 12 or 36 months. And that's absolutely correct, but the reality is every single hour, Amazon is looking at what instances you have running and what RIs you own and trying to match those up. And so you really need to look at your usage profile every single hour of that 12 or 36-month time period to understand what the optimum mix of reservations that you need really are. And so we'll talk about some tools here in a little bit to do that. The final piece here that I want to talk about is what makes up a reservation. And there's kind of three components here. There's the instance itself, and this is the instance family, M1, R3, M3. There's the size within that instance family, small, medium, large, etc. The OS, and then the AZ, the location, the availability zone, like US East 1A. So those coupled with the RI term, 1 year versus 3 year, and the RI type, light, medium, and heavy, make up the reservation and what I'll generally refer to as the RI class in this presentation, just because there's a lot of components floating around, so we'll group each of these individual line items would represent a different RI class. The challenge with reservations is that each RI class has a different price. So there are over 2,000 different reservation configurations across those classes. They each have their own upfront fee, they each have their own hourly usage price, and they each have their own break-even price, so how many months it's going to take until you recoup your costs and start saving money. So that makes it very challenging to look at RI purchases holistically. Realistically, you need to look at each RI class individually and what the specific break-even point is in order to understand when you should buy an RI and what type of RI you should actually be purchasing. So let's talk through purchasing strategies. There are two strategies here that I want to really focus on, but both of them can be summed up in a fairly simple mantra: buy early and often. And the keys of this are the early and the often. So let's kind of split those apart and talk through it. So first on the early. There's a lot of things that prevent people from buying RIs. There's your typical fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Should I wait until prices drop? What if our usage changes? I don't want to be locked into a contract for 3 years. The reality is, the longer you push off the decision, the more money you burn. And so I want to walk through an example on this. The general feeling in the market, I think, is that prices for compute or cloud in general are dropping rapidly and there's a race to the bottom. And while that's certainly true that Amazon and other vendors are dropping price, the reality is that those price drops have been very rational over time. So we went all the way back to 2009 and pulled pricing for an M1 large. And we compared that to reservation prices over the same time period. And what you can see is that as on-demand prices dropped, so did RI prices. And there's really never a time where an RI price or an on-demand price drops below what the previous RI price was. So it always makes sense to buy RIs. And even when you look at the effective rate, so in other words, if you amortize out the RI upfront fee, you can see it looks even more rational. So even if Amazon does drop a price, it makes sense to go ahead and lock in a reserved price as quickly as you can. So the other scenario that a lot of people ask about is, well, geez, prices are dropping, and I get that, and I'm fine buying an RI, but I should buy 3 one-year RIs versus 1 3-year RI because they keep dropping the price, and so it's going to work out better to have 3 one-year RIs. The math actually doesn't support this. So this, I'll let this kind of cycle through a few times. This is an animation that shows the difference between on-demand, 3 one-year RIs in blue, and 1 3-year RI in red. And essentially what you can see is that as usage decreases, there is a point, if I can get it to cycle. Try it again.
When you say 3 one-year RIs, you mean one after the other?
Exactly, 3 consecutive one-year RIs. And basically what happens here is that there is a point where as long as you're about 50% usage or above, where you maximize your savings by having an RI versus on demand. And there's really very few scenarios, except for at 100% usage, where 3 one-year RIs are ever really a better deal. So if you go to our blog, we've got this animation and a lot of detail around the analysis, but the bottom line is it makes the most sense to buy 3-year RIs and buy them as quickly as you can. Over the course of that time, you will save the most money with that alignment. Okay? So let's look at the worst case scenario, and this is everybody's fear. What if I bought an RI and literally the next day Amazon lowers the price? Well, the reality is we've done the analysis on this too. And we went back to February 2013 just as an example because it represented a typical price drop. The new on-demand price is still higher than the old RI price. So even if you buy and they lower the price the next day and you've got horrible buyer's remorse, it's still cheaper to lock in an RI as quickly as you can. We also see a lot of times people concerned about, well, we know Amazon's cadence is to reduce price every 4 to 6 months. So let me just wait 4 months and I'll buy an RI at the lower rate then. Well, here's how the math works out on that. The extra cost of running on demand versus an RI for 4 months is about $387 on an M3 medium. The savings from locking in a new price is $154, so you're essentially spending $233 more just for that one instance by waiting versus buying an RI. So the lesson in all of this, it doesn't pay to wait. You want to buy as quickly as you possibly can. So buy early and buy often. Let's talk about buying often. This second scenario focuses on purchase frequency. So this is, the basic scenario here is it's a 24-month period. You start with 10 instances, and you grow roughly 2 instances every month. So how often would you want to buy RIs for this? Well, there's a few ways you could look at this. If you just went with on-demand, you'd spend about $309,000 over the course of this 24-month period. If you bought annually, in other words, you bought RIs to cover your initial 10 reservations, and then at the end of the first year, you bought RIs to cover the 20 or so reservations that you're running at that point, you would spend about $205,000. So over the course of that year, of those 2 years actually, 48% of your hours would be covered by a reservation. You'd save about 34%. Not bad. If you bump that down to quarterly, you get close to 90% of your hours covered by reservation, and you're saving 63%. If you do monthly, you're at that 95% number, and you're saving 69%. So the faster you can purchase reservations, the better off you are from a savings standpoint. In fact, if you look at quarterly versus monthly, you may think, well, 63 versus 69% isn't that big of a deal. But even in this scenario, for a handful of instances over a 2-year period, it represents $40,000 in savings. So obviously, if you extrapolate this out across hundreds or thousands of instances, which is what a lot of you are running, I'm sure, you can see how large these savings can really become. So purchase RIs as frequently as possible. Buy early, buy often. By doing that, that helps drive minimizing the time through the loop and really helps reinforce the methodology. So how do you actually do this? How do you structure your monthly purchases? There are 4 things that I want to talk about here. The first is you want to cover as many hours as quickly as you can. So realistically, if you take the buy early, buy often mantra, you want to buy as much as you can and cover all of your hours as quickly as you can. The reality is you may not have the budget to do that. So if you're budget constrained, you want to focus your budget on high confidence purchases. So basically what I mean by this is buy reservations for instances that are always running or almost always running, instances that you know this is an app that is not auto-scaled. It's always up. It's mission critical. We're never turning it off. Let's cover our eyes for those. So focus your budget on high confidence purchases. And then the third thing is focus on the highest savings first. So buy reservations for instances that will have really rapid ROI. So in our application, we give you some levers to pull to do this right out of the gate. You can identify instances with high savings and identify instances that are heavily utilized and say, I only want recommendations for instances that are used at least 80% of the time and where my savings is going to be at least 20%. So this lets you take your limited budget of $10,000 or whatever it is and put that toward the instances where you're going to gain the most savings. And then over time, you work your way down that list and keep covering more and more instances such that in a year, every month, you start to have instances that come due. And so you can make a decision, do we want to renew reservations for those instances, or has infrastructure changed in a way where we want to buy new or different reservations? So this is a really effective way to make sure stuff stays aligned. And then the final thing here is to spread purchases horizontally across your infrastructure. So what I mean by this is you want to be somewhat tactical with RI purchases. We see situations where somebody will spin up a whole bunch of, let's say, i3 instances, and there's a lot of cost there, there's no doubt. So they'll buy reservations. Their first RI buy will be all i3s. And then 4 or 5 or 6 months go by, that product doesn't pan out, the company pivots, and they're stuck with a huge number of reservations. So what we recommend you do is cycle through horizontally across your infrastructure and cover RI buys across a host of different instance families so that if your needs do change, you're not totally locked in on a certain class of reservation or a certain class of instance, and it de-risks a lot of those purchases. So that's how you're going to structure monthly buys. Let's look at the second step here, which is measurement. So with measurement, what we want to look at are 2 different metrics that are really important. The first is instance coverage. So what you want to look at with instance coverage, whether you're looking at this by instance family, type, OS-AZ, is to understand what your reserved utilization rate is. In other words, how many total hours, a percentage of total hours, are covered by a reservation. This is a really effective metric in trying to understand holistically how your RI portfolio is aligned to your infrastructure. So in this case, I'm looking at this just purely based on instance family. Storage optimized, I've got like 95% coverage. On GPU intensive instances, we're down to 7%. So if I were looking to make some tactical buys, I would probably look to shore up stuff on the lower end of that GPU and memory and compute and leave storage alone at some level because we're already at a really high coverage rate. So instance coverage is really important. The second thing is your cost per hour. So one of the challenges with RIs that we see time and time again is usage goes up and cost goes up. At the same time, people are buying more and more RIs. So how do you tell if your overall cost is going up if your RI buys are actually effective? It can be really challenging, especially when you're running thousands of instances. So this is actually from our application. It's a feature we have, but I think it really shows effectively what you should focus on with reservations. And that is cost per hour. So let me explain what you're seeing here. Each of these stacked columns represents your usage, which is a combination of heavy RI usage, reserved hours, so light and medium, on-demand hours, and then in some cases, on the tail end there, unused heavy hours. So hours that you've purchased heavy reservations for, but haven't actually used because you have too much inventory. So we plot that out, and then we overlay on top of that your average hourly cost. And so this gives you a really effective way to see, all right, my usage is going up. I can see my RI buys, how they come in and out. But my overall hourly cost is generally going down, except for last month when we had some heavies that weren't actually used. So we bought some heavies, and then usage didn't go up in the way that we thought. So this is a really effective way, frankly, to normalize all of this data in a way to actually make sense of it. So you don't have to look at your total bill and say, well, geez, last month we spent $125,000. This month we're going to spend $150,000. Clearly the ROI buy was ineffective. May not be. It may have been highly effective, but you can't look at the top line. Okay? What's that? In this particular case, it is not, but yeah, you can look at it that way as well. Yeah.
That's really the reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The key to measuring that is you have to know what you paid for the upfront fee, so you've got to have all of the original RI data for that. Yeah. So the final kind of point here is that you want to focus measurement on two factors, your instance coverage and then reducing hourly cost. If you keep an eye on those two metrics and have them going in the right direction, then generally you can feel pretty confident with where you're steering the ship. So let's talk about learning from these and making changes. So since I'm talking about basing this methodology on kind of the lean software development methodology, learn is the step where you typically pivot or persevere. And we're going to take a similar approach to that with RIs, where you migrate, you modify, or you mature. So let's look at these three strategies of what you can learn from this and what sort of changes you make. Okay, so to begin, let's talk about migrate. Migrate is all about building an RI-friendly architecture where you increase flexibility and maximize cost savings. There are two strategies here, two strategies for making migration really effective. The first is to consolidate instance families. So why do you want to consolidate instance families? Why does this matter? For two reasons. First, RI modifications can only happen within a family. So you can only modify an RI within a single family like M1, M3, etc. So you can take an M1 small, convert that to an M1 large, but you can't go from an M1 small to an M3 large. So the fewer instance families you have, the larger the pool is, essentially, that you have to work with. And then the second thing is RIs can be applied across consolidated billing accounts. So if you buy an RI in account 1, but there's no instance to apply it to, Amazon will automatically look through the rest of your consolidated billing structure and see if there's an instance running in account 2 that it can apply it to. And if there is, then that instance will get the cost savings. That's great. The reality, though, is you need fewer instance families and more instances in order to create increase the chance of likelihood that Amazon will be able to find another instance to apply that reservation to. So by consolidating instance families, it gives Amazon basically more flexibility when they run the algorithms to apply this stuff to actually get RIs applied and increase your RI utilization rate. The second piece here is to migrate to modern instance types. So most people don't pay much attention to the cost savings that go along with instance types. But if you go from an M1 medium to an M3 medium, you can actually save about $150 a year. It's 20% savings. And on top of that, you get a more powerful instance. So there are some considerations you have to pay attention to on this, especially in terms of storage, from legacy instances to new instances. Again, we've got a lot of content about all of those limitations on cloudability.com on our blog if you want to learn more. But generally speaking, if you can move to more modern instances, it's going to give you lower prices and more flexibility. The good news is Amazon's done a really good job of laying out migration paths for all of these. This is all readily available on their website, and you can see what type of instance you're using and under what conditions you should migrate it to different modern instance types. So it can be fairly easy and fairly effective to figure that out. There's some strategy, though, that goes into this. So I want to talk through migration strategy. The first thing here is you need to proactively plan instance type migrations. This is a scenario where finance and DevOps have to actually talk. And the reason that it's helpful for that coordination to happen is so that DevOps is not planning migrations away from instance types that finance is about to buy a whole bunch of reservations for, and that DevOps also has an understanding and a visibility into, hey, if you guys move to M3s, we could save 20%, and there's really no reason other than they just haven't spent the time to make the migration from M1 to M3 for that to happen. So simply understanding, both from an operational perspective and a cost perspective, what the implications are for migration can really help drive that strategy. The second thing is to tactically renew reservations on legacy instances. So we see a lot of hesitation from people to renew instances. In other words, if you have an M1 instance, people don't want to renew it because that's legacy. We're trying to get off of that as a company, so we're not going to buy RIs for it. The reality is, in most companies that we work with, even if the desire is to get off of M1s, you're still probably going to have a fairly large number of them for some period of time as you make that migration. So you might as well cover RIs with whatever you're confident is going to be around for a while. High-frequency reservation purchases really make this transition easier because every month you've got reservations coming due or you're making modifications, so you can make much more tactical calls on what to do there. The reality is M1 reservations are still a really good deal. Most M1s have a break-even point between 5 and 6 months. And so if you're still going to be using them in 6 months, you might as well buy an RI because then anything after that is going to be pure savings for you. The other thing to keep in mind, you can look on the RI marketplace and find RIs that other companies are selling that may have a shorter duration. So you could pick up a 6 or a 7 month M1 RI and use that to cover any legacy instance type until you migrate off of it. So that's a really slick way to get RI coverage, even if you know you're going to be migrating off of those and shorter than the RI term. So that's migrate. Let's talk modify. Modifying reserved instances, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but just understand that if you have a licensed OS, you have less flexibility on making modifications. If you're running generic Linux, you can change instance type, AZ, network. If you have a licensed OS, you can just change AZ and network. And reservations can't be moved between accounts. So those are some of the ground rules, so to speak, for modifying RIs. You're going to modify within a family. So each column here represents a family, M1, M2, M3. And you can see a fair number of these, 3 of them are actually legacy families. There are some instance types that don't have a family. The good news is 6 out of the 8 of these are legacy instances. So over time, you're going to have fewer and fewer orphans. And you won't have to deal with this as much, and we'll have more flexibility when it comes to modifications. So the way modifications work, if you're not familiar, is each instance type has a normalization factor. So this is a point scheme that's divisible by the next size instance. A small is worth 1 point, a medium 2, etc. So what you can do with this is, let's say I've got a 2XL. It's worth 16 points or 16 units. I could convert that into 2 extra larges. And I could do that because those are 8 points each. 8 plus 8 equals 16. I know it's late in the day. So as long as everything adds up to the same units as the original reservation, you can make any change you want. So 2 extra larges goes into 4 larges into 8 mediums into 16 smalls. And this is all bidirectional. So you could go up or down, take 2 smalls and convert it into a medium, whatever you want to do. The reality with all of this, reservations represent sunk cost. You've already spent the money. If it's a heavy reservation, you're paying that money out every single month, whether you use it or not. So it behooves you to modify your reservations to maximize the savings and make sure that they're constantly aligned to your infrastructure changes. At Cloudability, we handle that by doing RI recommendations or modification recommendations. And what we do here that's interesting is we give you the ability to essentially say, look at my infrastructure, look at my existing reservation portfolio, figure out how many units I have, and then figure out where I can most efficiently apply those units to maximize my savings. So we treat this almost like a coin counting exercise where we figure out, in this case, you've got 52 units. Right now, those are all stuck with M3 larges and US East 1E. You're not getting a whole lot of value out of that. Let's break that out into several M3 larges and different AZs and some M3 2XLs and another AZ. We're taking all 52 units, applying them out, and increasing your overall savings rate. So there's some interesting ways to do this. Realistically, though, there's math, and you probably need some software to help you to make sense of all of the algorithms that you really have to apply to understand where the break-even points are and where you can most effectively apply those changes. The final thing here with modifications isn't really a modification, but the Amazon EC2 reserved instance marketplace can kind of be a last stop for you. So if you have a reservation and you simply can't modify the existing reservation, then you can sell them on the marketplace. That's a viable option. You get out from under it, you recoup some cost, and you move on. So the final piece here is mature. If you're doing everything right and you're making iterative monthly buys and you're constantly realigning to your infrastructure changes, you're going to get to a point where you're making the right decisions. And you have reservations in your portfolio that don't need to change. And so in these cases, you simply let them mature. So coverage is king in this scenario. You want to make sure that if you have, or you want to make sure realistically that you have coverage on all of your instance types. If you do and you're approaching that 95% threshold, which is kind of both the practical and the theoretical maximum that you can get to if you're doing monthly buys, and assume that in the prior month you have on-demand that's not going to be covered because you haven't done the buy yet, you can feel pretty confident that you're letting reservations mature in the right way. So some conclusions here. The first is the buy, measure, learn methodology. If implemented and you can get that down to like a monthly cadence, gives you the best chance of having really high levels of RI coverage. And when you buy and make your purchases and measure and determine your ROI, you can use that to realign your infrastructure to your reservations, align your reservations to your infrastructure, and really have a high degree of coverage. So let's finish with some takeaways. Buy RIs early and often. Focus your budget on high confidence purchases so that you know exactly where you stand. Measure RI coverage and cost per hour metrics. And then finally, migrate, modify, and mature reservations to achieve 95% coverage. So if you can work your way through this, you'll be positioned fairly strongly with a high degree of coverage. I'm happy to take questions if you have them. Otherwise, thank you very much.